Hello, I am Molly, and today I'm going to show you how to make an awesome quilt. Follow these steps and I guarantee you'll succeed. The first thing you will have to do in order to make a quilt is pick out some pretty fabric that you like. Ooh, I like this one, and this fabric goes perfectly with it too. Before you start sewing your quilt, you will need to decide how big you want your quilt and what size your squares are going to be. I usually use templates like this to cut out my squares. When you're cutting your squares, you can either use scissors or a sewing tool that looks like this, so it can be a lot easier. When you are done cutting out some squares, cut out all the rest of the squares that you need in order to make your quilt. You will also need a back for your quilt. You may use that later. Today I've decided to make a small doll quilt. I finished cutting my squares and I arranged them in the way that I like. The next step will be to pin your squares together. Take two squares and put the front side of the fabric facing to the other front side of the fabric. Pin them together with 2 or 3 pins. When you are done, proceed to pin the other squares. When you're done pinning, you are ready to sew. You can either sew on the machine, like I'm doing, or sew by hand. If you are going to sew on the machine, make sure your machine is threaded and ready to go. Sew the fabric together on one side like this. Notice how I sewed on the back side of the fabric, but when you open it up, it is correctly sewn. After you're done sewing all the pairs of squares together, you will need to pin them together of the pairs of 2. Pin them together like this so you can make longer rows of squares. Now I am sewing the pairs of 2 together to make rows. After I've sewed all the pairs of 2 together, I will sew each row together until I complete the front of my quilt. Now that you've finished your front, you should probably iron the back so that it lays flat. After you're done ironing, you shall get batting and your back. Cut them both the same size as the front. When you're done cutting the batting, then cut the back the same size as the front. After you're done cutting all the pieces out, then put the front on top of the back, fronts facing each other, and put the batting underneath. Then pin them in every place you think you will need them to be pinned. Now I am ready to sew the perimeter of the quilt. Ow! I slowed my finger! Just kidding. perimeter. If you can see, I left a little hole right here. You need to leave a little hole so you can flip it inside out. Now that my quilt is right side out, I will sew the hole together with the whip stitch. Now that I'm done whip stitching the hole shut, I will tie little yarn knots where each square meets to hold the quilt in place. Now you will have an awesome quilt that's just right for a doll.